Our next talk is Avoiding Insidious Points of Compromise in Infrastructure Access Systems. Our speaker is Sharon Goldberg. Sharon Goldberg is the CEO, co-founder of Bastions, a startup that is reimagining the tools that engineers use to secure remote access to infrastructure. She is also a tenured professor at the Computer Science Department at Boston University. If you want to submit questions, you could go to slido.com, hashtag BSidesSF 2022. Thank you. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored and happy to be speaking to such a great group of people. So, please, if what we're talking about is interesting, please come see me or my colleague, Ming, who's sitting right here, and tell us your war stories about your infrastructure access systems. We'd love to hear it. It's super helpful for us. So this talk is going to be mostly war stories. So I'm going to tell 5 different incidents, some of which, so I've got NotPetya and SolarWinds up there. How many people know in grand detail what happened in NotPetya, for example, in this room? How many know like sort of every detail? Okay. And how many people know every detail of what happened with SolarWinds? Okay, so I'm going to go into like specific pieces of this that are relevant to kind of the point I'm trying to make about how to think about these types of systems. So some of this stuff is a little bit more obscure. And some of these are really random, like FluffyBunny from 2001 is basically a story that was told to me by Andy Ellis, who's the CISO of Akamai. So this is an Akamai hack story from the dinosaur years. And Andy was actually supposed to be here giving this talk with me, but he couldn't make it because of the date change. So you just get me instead. So let's get into it. So basically I'm going to have 3 acts. The first one is sort of the standing credential approach to infrastructure access. So let me back up for a second. I'm specifically talking about you have cloud or data center infrastructure. You have engineers that need to access that infrastructure. That used to be just SSH. Now it's more. It can be kube control. It can be access to databases. It can be access to Windows servers. It can be RDP. All of these different systems that engineers use to access their systems. How do you make sure that that doesn't become a point of compromise, right? And I have the picture on the right with the bunch of squares around the cloud, right? The idea is like we put so much security in to keep outsiders out of our system, which is great. But then the engineers do need to get in at some point, at least in most places. And so how do you avoid having that become a big issue? So I'm going to look at all of these incidents and see what they can teach us about how to build these kinds of systems properly. Okay. So I'm going to start, and so in each one I'm going to start with a different sort of approach and talk about sort of issues here. So this is a picture of a Bastion host. I'm obviously very obsessed with Bastions as the CEO of Bastion. What a Bastion is a box that sits in front of other boxes. And the idea is you don't want your people to access the boxes directly. You want to have something in the middle that you can use to aggregate that access to avoid to avoid them all being exposed to the internet, or to even just have a way of like filtering the connections and seeing who's going in and things like this. Right? And so in this picture, I've got a very particular kind of Bastion architecture where what I have is the user has some key that would allow her to log into the Bastion. And then there are some other keys on this Bastion that are allowing you to access other types of targets that are behind it. In this picture, it's just a bunch of servers. So this is a FluffyBunny incident that you've probably never heard of, but this happened to Andy Ellis. And when I talk about Bastions, this is the story he tells me. So I'll just channel Andy. And so in 2001, there was this hacker. And this was like the old days where there was like sort of just like malice for fun, you know? This was before the ransomware days. So what this group of people did, was they hacked into some users' machines and they replaced their SSH client with a new client that was exfiltrating SSH passwords. So basically, instead of running a proper SSH client, you ran this adversary's client, and it would steal your passwords and send it to the adversary. And so what they did was they compromised the users, and then from there, because they had stolen this key, they could then log into the Bastion. And so what they then did was they sat on this Bastion, which was now owned by them. They also ripped out the existing SSH client and put in their adversarial SSH client. And then they were starting to exfiltrate all the passwords that were coming in through that client. So you can imagine like they were just sitting here in the Bastion and just collecting passwords as users were appearing, logging in and putting in their passwords to access the next target, and they were just collecting all of those passwords, right? And so, when Andy tells this story, he actually says that they were not as affected because this adversary luckily did not decide to exfiltrate the passphrases that were used to unlock SSH keys, so they were not as hacked as others could have been. But this was sort of a moment that caused them to change the way they think about credentials. And so this is like the classic incident that anyone who runs a Bastion host worries about. Like if an adversary gets into your Bastion host, what kind of damage can they cause? Because it's such a point of aggregation for your infrastructure. So a couple of lessons to take from this. Is this is like sort of the classic story that we've all been hearing, and I'm going to talk about this notion of zero trust in a couple slides. Don't give your users standing credentials. And the issue here, right, was that when the adversary actually exfiltrated the credentials, those credentials were good for a really long time. So when you steal them, you don't necessarily even have to use them right away. You can use them later, and the victim doesn't know what happened because these credentials may have been stolen 6 months before, and now the adversary is using them. Another thing that I think that a lot of people are familiar with, like if you have a Bastion host, it's a very sensitive place in your infrastructure. So it's really important to think about like, how do you make sure that this thing is not, not unpatched, it's not running some old software. Like you have to sort of stay on top of this because it's a place where if people get in, there's a lot of information that can be pulled out of it. And the last lesson is use MFA. So I'm a professor, by the way, so if I want to just turn this into like my InfoSec 101 class, so why would MFA help with this? Any thoughts on how MFA could have potentially helped with this attack?
They got the passwords, but they wouldn't be able to log in because they couldn't do that MFA.
They couldn't steal your MFA, right? So like we're talking about 2001. I'm not even sure that there was MFA in 2001. I'm having trouble remembering. I'm fairly old, but I wasn't in InfoSec in 2001. There was, yeah. So this was another way, right? Because stealing SSH passwords, stealing SSH keys doesn't have to be so deadly if there's an additional form of authentication that's not the key, right? So that's another good reason to use MFA. So this is a very old example, but it gives you a good sense of like why it's important to think about like what credentials are long-lived and what you're doing to actually authenticate your users. Okay, great. All right, so here's another architecture that everyone in the room is familiar. So in this architecture, instead of having your targets exposed to the internet, you put your targets behind a VPN. So when the user wants to access something, they have to first log into the VPN with their VPN credential, and then when they do that, they can go to the specific target. Okay. So I'll tell you a story of Operation Aurora. How many people are familiar with this incident? A little bit? Okay. So this was an early APT, believed to be a Chinese APT. And what I recall happening here was there was a Microsoft Internet Explorer 0-day that they found. And effectively what happened was when a user when a user clicked something, there was this vulnerability, the 0-day in Internet Explorer that was exploited, and then that machine was owned. So this is another story I got from Andy because Akamai was actually affected by this. And if you hear, so I'm again going to channel Andy here. If you hear him tell the story, he actually said that the dwell time of this adversary was so long that they didn't know it was in the network. And they didn't actually know when they were compromised, and they don't know who was initially compromised. So, and if you go back and read the stuff from a decade ago about this incident, it's all about the Internet Explorer vulnerability. It's super interesting. You don't really see much about what happened next. So what happened next was that and this is so relevant because the talk we had before was supply chain attacks, right? What happened next was that the adversary was moving, quoting Andy, in the soft, sticky inside of this squishy inside of this network, right? And sort of moving laterally across these machines. And then what it ended up doing was it ended up going to the Perforce software, which is the version control software that they had for their code. And they were trying to sort of get information, steal source code from all of these companies. So this was actually an early software supply chain attack. That's what they were after. They were after the source code. And the way they did it was through lateral movement through this network. So if you hear the way that Andy describes this story, he actually did not know that they were even compromised because they were being so quiet about it, that the way they found out was because Google had these targets, the ones in red, they were being controlled by a command and control server that was, I believe, in Taiwan. And they didn't know that this was happening. So at some point, they were able to take the adversary's command and control server over. I believe it was Google. And then Google called Akamai and said, hey guys, like, do you realize some of your machines are talking to this command and control server? So they didn't even know they were inside because they were doing such a sort of quiet motion around. Because if you think about what they were trying to do, which was just steal code, you don't really want to expose that that's happening. So this was a sort of very early example of the issue with trusting perimeter VPNs too much. So just believing that people are behind the VPN is a good enough, or people, not people, machines or whatever flows of data are behind the VPN is not a good enough reason to let them access certain things. And this is where a lot of the movement to like this idea of zero trust, like don't trust people based on their network location. You need to trust them, you need to actually ask them to log into the exact part of the network that they're needing to logging into. The other thing about this was that at the time, Andy describes Akamai as not being a very segmented infrastructure. So again, this is 2009. So there was sort of this whole array of machines that were behind one VPN, and you could kind of move across these machines. So the VPN itself was not well segmented, right? So when you think about these types of systems, and for any sort of access system, it's important to kind of break up your infrastructure into different groups of sensitivity or type, and make sure that access is not granted from one group to the other if it doesn't need to be, right? So this was one of the things that Andy describes Akamai spending like basically 10 years doing after this incident. Okay. All right, great. Okay, this one is really interesting. So okay, so let me start with the tool first. So the way that AD administration works, it looks a lot like a Bastion host. What commonly happens is you have IT administrators that need to administrate a bunch of servers or laptops or whatever it is. And what they typically do is they log into an admin server with their credential, and then they their admin credential is then used to log into the actual machines that they're trying to to manage or do whatever they're trying to do to. And this is really surprising to me because before I started this company, actually, a professor, like I've never done AD admin, so I'm going to again channel Andy here. A lot of organizations, even in 2017, were using a single admin credential across a lot of their infrastructure. So just one admin credential would control access to a lot of their machines. And so there's an article in Wired, which everyone should go read. It's super, super, super good read, like just a great story. The story of what happened at Merck. Has anyone read that Wired article about what happened at Merck during NotPetya? Yeah, you should go read it. It's really interesting. So like they describe like people running through the halls, like pulling machines out of the wall, because in the course of an hour or two or three, all of their machines were bricked by ransomware. The story starts, and it's even more relevant today. Sometimes revisiting these things is so interesting, later, because there was one machine. This is a watering hole attack. Is people familiar with the notion of watering hole attack? Okay, so watering hole attack, for those who don't know, is when you hack something, right? In this case, it's a Ukrainian tax software, and you wait for people to interact with that thing that you've hacked. And once you interact with it, you get hit by malware, right? So what happened here was according to the Wired story, which talks about Merck and how Merck was hit by this, they had one server that was interacting with this Ukrainian accounting software. And when it did the software update, that software was a malware. And what that malware appears to have done is stolen the AD admin credential. Okay, so now this one, basically they talk about one machine in Ukraine that was compromised, and this credential was then stolen, and then it was used to basically log into all of these machines with administrative access, and it was all done very, very quickly. So you get this story of like all the machines getting pulled out of the walls, and people just like throwing their laptops away or turning them off so that this would stop propagating. And it took them like two weeks to sort of reissue computers to everyone in the company because all the computers were basically bricked in this way. And it was because the AD credential is so powerful. So this is like, Okay, so this is why I really think about this a lot, because we have a tendency in the security industry to like solve problems that when we worry about our users getting hacked, right? We worry about our users getting hacked, so we solve the problem by putting in some kind of trusted system that's going to eliminate the risk of the users getting hacked, right? But the system itself may be extremely overprivileged, right? The system itself may have really, really deep privileges into your infrastructure. And so if someone actually compromises that system, then the impact is really big. So that's why I bring this example up specifically, like, I'm just giving my spin on it, is that like, it's crazy that there was one admin credential here and it was used across the board to attack everything. But it's something to think about. So admin credentials with overbroad scope are dangerous. Segment your infrastructure. AD admin is a single point of compromise. And we already talked about software supply chain. I actually didn't realize I was going to be talking right after a software supply chain talk. But that's another important thing. So I think one thing to take out of this is like, when you think about what you've built or what your systems look like try to think if there's one master credential in there somewhere that if hacked, like terrible things happen. A lot of times these things exist and nobody notices. And this NotPetya incident is a good example of like terrible things that can happen if you do that. And so for example, with AD administration, you want to have, tiered administration. You want to have different credentials for different parts of the network and things like that. But that wasn't necessarily done. And actually was surprised to see this, but this was 2017. So it wasn't really that long ago that people still had architectures like this. Okay. Okay, so I'll keep going. Great. All right, so enter zero trust, right? So like 3 incidents to set us up to look at why these zero trust approaches are important. How many people are rolling their eyes when I say zero trust? Okay, so everyone's rolling their eyes. It has meaning, so I'm going to put my professor hat on. It actually has meaning. It has real meaning to me. And by the way, when we started Bastion Zero, and that zero is partly zero trust and partly zero bastions, when we started Bastion Zero, we were like talking about zero trust and we didn't understand what it meant. So I'll tell you what I think it means for access, for this specific problem space, which is access, remote access. What does zero trust mean? It means don't trust the user with long-lived credentials. Don't trust the user because of their IP address. That's what it means. So it's all about the user, right? Make sure that you're not assuming that just because someone has a particular network address, they should be good to access something. Make sure you're not giving them a long-lived credential so that it doesn't get stolen like it did with FluffyBunny, right? That's what zero trust tends to mean. And those are like, despite you rolling your eyes, those are like legitimately worthy goals that I think people could agree to do, right? And I know that the term is highly used, but that's what it means, right? So this is a picture of a way to build a zero trust system. How do we actually implement this? There's a lot of different ways. So you can build different kinds of authentication systems that will provide this type of zero trust system, right? So you can build a certificate authority that would issue short-lived certificates to the user whenever they log in. Right, so they authenticate to the certificate authority. Imagine the yellow box is a certificate authority. They authenticate to that thing. They get a short-lived certificate, and that lets them access the target that they want to access. And then the certificate expires after an hour or 5 minutes, and then they can't get access until they authenticate again. So that's a great example of zero trust access with a certificate authority. You can do the same thing with a single sign-on, right? You can log into your G Suite or your Okta, and then you can get a short-lived token that would give you access to the targets. So there's lots of different ways to do this. This is a picture of zero trust with a certificate authority, right? So Alice over here is getting access from the CA to a particular target, and that's the example of the certificate. If you do it with an SSO, what you might get is something like a SAML token or an OpenID Connect, JOT, but anything like this. It's a short-lived token, a short-lived credential that the target uses to determine if the user should have access. Okay, so this is cool. So like, I'll just tell a personal story. When we started Bastion Zero, we looked at zero trust and we realized what zero trust means is like basically one of these things that I showed you. And then I said, wait a minute, certificates, like, here's something that I've been teaching in my class since it happened. And I will say that this incident for me is in my list of top 5 security incidents for me personally. And I think it's because it happened in the second year that I was a professor. So it was like in my formative youth, this happened. So how many people know the DigiNotar incident? So not everyone. Have you heard of it? Heard of it. Okay, so a lot of people haven't heard of it. This is like watershed security incident, but it's not in cloud, it's in TLS. But here's what happened. So there was a CA in the Netherlands called DigiNotar, and what it does is it provides access to sites in the Netherlands, like the DMV and things like this. It got hacked, and the key was stolen. And so the adversary actually had the signing key for the certificate authority, and it was able to issue certificates for whatever it wanted. What it decided to do was issue certificates for Google and hijack Google traffic, and it was actually able to introspect on TLS traffic for Google. This incident highlighted a couple of things. It highlighted that CAs are a single point of compromise if trusted blindly and they get compromised. It's super bad. It's very similar to the idea of the AD credential. And this is actually what happened in the TLS world. Is the TLS world moved on from CAs and started doing things like certificate transparency and certificate pinning and all these other really great things to like lessen the risk from CAs. Okay, SolarWinds. So everyone, SolarWinds incident. Do people know about the SAML part of the SolarWinds incident? The SAML part. Okay, so everyone knows the SAML part. So just really quickly, one of the things that happened with SolarWinds, after the adversary compromised all the things that they compromised, they actually went after the ADFS server for their victims, and they stole the ADFS server signing key. So they were able to create their own SSO tokens for anything they wanted, and once they did that, they could log into anything they wanted. So there were all the things that happened in SolarWinds, but this was the ultimate thing that they hacked, and from there they own the entire network for their victims, right? So again, another example of like trusting SSO too much, dangerous, right? Okay, question for you in my remaining time. So you get my point. Question for you in my remaining time. If we had MFA, would that have stopped the SolarWinds incident? It depends. Awesome, yes. So if we had MFA like in my picture, it would have stopped the SolarWinds incident. No, right? Because who cares, right? Because the adversary would have still stolen this key and walked away with the key and made TAML tokens for itself, right? If MFA goes to the SSO provider, then it's no good to stop attacks on the SSO provider, right? So here's an alternative architecture, and then I'm done. Right? Another way, if they had used MFA in this way, then it would have actually been able to stop the attack, right? If the MFA was a separate component in the system and the MFA wasn't going to the SSO provider, then the adversary would then need to compromise both the SSO and the MFA in order to access the targets, right? Do you see the difference, right? Because the SSO is, the targets are validating token from the MFA. You can see the orange token, and they're also validating the yellow token, both of them separately, and that's what's required to access the target. So if you think about the way you build access systems, a better way to do it is if you're going to put something behind an SSO, you should have an independent MFA as well, that you don't have to risk the SSO getting compromised. So spoiler, this is basically what our architecture looks like, right? So the idea is when you think about zero trust and you think about access, it's important to think about the users getting hacked. Super important, right? Like the first 3 stories that I told you. But then also think about your access system getting hacked and how do you actually stop that from happening? And that's really where our focus is in the company. And I'm happy to tell you more, but I don't have any more time. So this is a picture basically of how we do it. And I can tell you more about that later. But this is the bottom line, right? So we think about securing the users. We don't want the users to have standing credentials. We don't want to trust a user just because of their network location. Those are the 2 tenets of zero trust. Segment your infrastructure, also arguably a tenet of zero trust. But then in building such a system, be careful that you don't put a giant credential in there or a giant CA or something like this that controls access to everything, because if you do, that is where the adversary will go, and we've seen the adversary go there, right? So it's another thing to think about. And with that, I will be done. The slides are available on our website. I'm on Twitter as well, so please reach out and let me know your thoughts about this talk. I'd love to hear about kind of what you've been thinking about with regards to this problem. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have 1 minute for questions, if anybody has any questions. Questions.
Okay, I'll just say recommended reading, that article about Merck getting hacked. Everybody read the DigiNotar incident. Everyone needs to know about that. Yeah. Sandworm, if you don't want to buy the book, you can read the article in Wired, which is an excerpt from the book. Yeah.
You have a question?
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.